Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second talk of the seminar series, sponsored by the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Daniel Beckman, who is here as a Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Center. Daniel received his bachelor's degree from the College of New Jersey. Then, in order to pursue his interests in ancient Persia, he moved both to a better climate and to arguably to the best program in the United States for that subject. That is, he entered the program in Iranian Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles. He received his PhD last June with a dissertation called The Use of Treaties in the Achaemenid Empire. Needless to say, Daniel is an expert on the history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And to date, he has published 3 major articles on this period. One of them is called Cyrus the Great in Ancient Propaganda, and it is forthcoming in a book called Cyrus the Great, Life and Lore, to be published by Harvard University Press. And he has 2 major articles, one in the Journal of Persianate Studies called King Artaxerxes' Aegean Policy, and a 3rd article in Iranian Studies for 2018, so it's just out, called The Many Deaths of Cyrus the Great. Yes, he seems to have died more than once. This last essay, which I recently read, is a persuasive and masterful demonstration that the varying accounts of Cyrus's death in our Greek sources, we have 3 different accounts, reflect 3 different phases of Persian propaganda. But all of his work displays an enviable ability to judiciously combine all of the various evidence, that is, sources of information, both Greek and Persian, while placing each source in its proper cultural and historical context. Too often Greek historians only deal with the Greek sources. Historians of the ancient Near East use the Greek sources in a rather naive way, but Daniel's able to combine both sets of sources and archaeological information using a sophisticated methodology. And that's a hallmark of his work. More than that, I can hardly express to you how delighted I was when Daniel introduced himself to me at our opening reception in the Department of Classics. It goes without saying that the history of the ancient Near East, broadly defined, represents a major gap in the curriculum of this university. In the Department of Classics, including myself, there are 3 ancient Greek historians, Nino Laragi at the table being another one. And while it goes without saying that no historian of ancient Greece can be ignorant of Greek relations of Persia, since the Persians loom so large, both in the Greek imagination and in their practical affairs, none of us are experts in the Achaemenid period. So Daniel's presence here for the next 3 years is an invaluable gift that this center has given both to my department and to the university as a whole, for which we are extremely grateful. But there is more to it than that. My own principal teacher of ancient Greek history was a New Zealander named George Cockwell, who was conservative in every way except for this. He would begin his undergraduate lectures at Oxford with an unconventional declaration. He would say that he was a Medizer, which is a technical term for someone who took the side of the Medes and the Persians. And he would say that the Greeks were much better off, would have been much better off, if they had become absorbed into the Persian Empire. For one thing, he argued, Persian rule would have put an end to their incessant internecine strife and quarrels. Well, that's a proposition worth considering, but perhaps for a different day. In any case, let's now turn to the topic of today's lecture, which Dr. Beckman is going to deliver Managing the Greek Frontier, Achaemenid Strategies in the West.
All right, let me begin by thanking everyone for coming and giving me this opportunity to present some of my research to you all. Thanks, of course, to Michael for those very kind words, and of course to Reagan for putting this all together. As Michael said, my research focuses on the history of pre-Islamic Iran, namely the Achaemenid and Hellenistic periods. What I'm really interested in, probably because of my background in classical history, is understanding how information travels from the Near East and Iran specifically to the West and then shows up in our Greek and Latin texts. A lot of what I do involves trying to separate the propaganda that is intentionally generated in the Near East from the factual information, what we might call, historically accurate information about the realities of the Near East and the Persian Empire, which then again makes its way to the West. This also entails understanding not just the historical realities of the Near East, but understanding how the Greeks and the Romans understand this information, manipulate this information, completely misinterpret this information, whatever the case may be. And my first real foray into this was in my dissertation. It required me to not only analyze the Near Eastern texts to the best of my ability, but because we have so few of those texts, or at least so few of the texts that we would like to have, I was required to rely more heavily on Western texts, but then of course to interpret them properly. So to begin with, some basic information. I understand that we have folks with a lot of different backgrounds in the room today. So what was the Achaemenid Persian Empire? Very briefly, it was founded in approximately 550 BCE, depending on exactly which event we want to choose as the starting date. It was established by the conquests of a king called Cyrus the Great. And he and his immediate successors went on to conquer what became the largest land empire that had existed up to that point. So the Achaemenid Persians ruled everything from Central Asia to Egypt, from Thrace in what is now northern Greece, over to the borders of India. And this massive multi-ethnic empire remained until 330 BCE, when it was conquered by Alexander the Great and his army that was mainly consisting of Greco-Macedonian troops. Now, one problem in the history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, or at least it's become a problem for some historians, is a series of treaties that were made between the Achaemenids and Greek states, namely Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, between about 450 and 350 BCE. The problem was that some historians, some modern historians, felt that it was unreasonable to believe that the great king of Persia, possibly the most powerful man on earth at the time, would humble himself by acknowledging a border to his empire beyond which he would not expand. And not only was this agreement to stop Persian expansion, it was an agreement with a state like Athens, which perhaps those of us from a classics background think of Athens as the foundation of Western civilization and the home of so many of our cultural heroes, but really in comparison to an empire like Persia, it was barely even a dot on the map. So it has been argued that this imbalance of power means that it was most likely that a treaty such as we will be looking at later is actually a historical fiction. It's probably just Greek propaganda. I have argued that the historical evidence, as sparse as it is, does allow for both of these arguments, but we are best served if we acknowledge that the treaty did in fact exist, and it is the beginning of a pattern of these treaties which we see lasted for about 100 years. And really, I found that there are two separate questions to be answered when analyzing these Greco-Persian treaties. The first was, what aspect of Achaemenid imperial ideology made it acceptable for the king to enter into a binding agreement with a non-equal partner? And what role did these treaties play in Achaemenid imperial strategy? So we have, on the one hand, the justification for these treaties, or how the king represented these treaties to himself and to his elites within the empire, and also the practical purpose that these treaties were to serve in the best interests of the running of the empire. One way to answer this question was to ask what a treaty would have meant to an Achaemenid. What expectations would they have had going into these negotiations with a Greek city? And of course, we don't know. This is not the sort of thing that is revealed in any of the texts that we have. But it is my conviction that we can sort of work around this problem, because it is a generally accepted fact, it's certainly not proven in as much detail as we would like, that the Persian state arose out of an environment which was greatly influenced by Mesopotamian and Near Eastern history in general. Some of our sources make it seem as if the Persians just one day jump up out of the savage, western area of the Near East and just take over, most of the world. But that's really not the case. As complicated as the story of the origins of the Persian state are, it is pretty clear that at least two important elements in that initial rise of the Persian state are the Medes and the Elamites. These were groups that live in what is now western Iran, and they had long-standing contacts with the ancient Near East, going back literally centuries. And this is relevant because in the Near East in general, there is a very strong treaty tradition. The treaty, by the time of the Persian state, was already a very ancient tradition. It goes back until at least the 3rd millennium. But what I want to focus on here is the use of treaties in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This was an empire of Mesopotamian origins. As the name suggests, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it was an iteration of the Assyrian state, and we're talking about a period of basically the first half of the 1st millennium BCE, give or take. Now, as I said, the treaties had been in use for centuries before the rise of the Neo-Assyrian state, but the Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrian state, brought some innovations. For them, the treaty was not a tool for establishing peace. It was not about mutually beneficial alliances. It was a weapon. It was designed to create and or perpetuate a profoundly unequal relationship between the Assyrian state and the other party, which was designed really to maximize the Assyrians' ability to extract wealth and exploit whatever the weaker party was. So just a couple of examples of treaty text. I should have said, for those of us who are less familiar with the Achaemenids, this is more or less the empire. As you can see here, traditionally we look at it with these solid borders, which is a very nice thing to have because it sort of isolates the topic at hand and lets us ignore everything else. But it's not really very accurate. For those of us who are ancient historians of any type, we know that the idea of a fixed border and a territorial empire is a relatively modern invention, or at least a modern concept. Which is why I prefer typically to use a map like this, where the main regions of the empire are still highlighted, but there's no actual definition of the borders of the territory of the empire. And this is going to be relevant for later on, because when we talk about administrative practices of the Achaemenid Empire, typically we think of course that must be limited to the empire itself. You can't impose your legal system outside of your own state, right? I'm going to say that that's actually not quite true. It does appear that with a state like, as powerful as the Achaemenid Empire, you can actually project your administrative structures beyond the lands which you nominally rule. So getting back to Assyrian treaties. These are excerpts from treaty texts. Of course, this is not comprehensive. It's just, I believe, an illustrative example. And we should, of course, note that, once again, with all ancient texts, they're going to be very fragmentary, and there are many situations where we don't know the exact context of these treaties, but of course, we do the best we can. So just for one example, Assurbanipal, an Assyrian king, has come to an agreement with a elite Babylonian faction. We don't know the further details about them. And they are made to swear that we will love Assurbanipal, the king of Assyria, our lord. He's going to be our king and lord. We will not seek any other king or lord for ourselves, so on and so forth. So this is all to illustrate that submission in the form of a treaty is absolute. Okay, so these Babylonians are saying that this nominally foreign king is now their king, and it's not about just a military alliance or establishing regulations for trade or something like that. Unequivocally, the king of Assyria is now the king of Babylon. Full stop. Another example. This is from the period just before the first treaty. It's under the king Esarhaddon. He has made an agreement with Medes. Those are the Iranian group that I mentioned earlier. And this is a treaty which basically he's going to be employing Medes as royal bodyguards. And I selected this example because it talks about the oath and the penalties for breaking that oath. So whoever changes, disregards, transgresses, or erases the oaths of this tablet may assure the king of the gods, ordainer of destinies, decree an evil fate, an evil and unpleasant fate for you. May he not grant you long-lasting old age. May Ninurta, the foremost among the gods, fell you with his fierce arrow. May he fill the plain with your blood and feed your flesh to the eagle and vulture. And it goes on. There's just line after line after these very gruesome, violent descriptions of what's going to happen to you if you in any way violate this treaty. And let's definitely not ignore the fact that not only can you not violate the oath, the treaty text, the physical tablet itself, is essentially a sacred object. It can't be erased or destroyed or changed in any way. The agreement with Assyria, your submission is not only total, it's eternal. There is going to be no renegotiations, anything like that. And of course, if you break the treaty, you will be punished. And it is the gods that are causing that punishment. They're forcing that punishment not only upon you breaking the oath, but it's the king of Assyria. It's his divine task to carry out that punishment. Okay. And finally, our last example is not actually a treaty text. It comes from an inscription of the same king, Esarhaddon, where he is talking about a treaty that he made, this time with the Elamites and Gutians. The Elamites we referenced earlier as yet another Iranian group. So according to Esarhaddon, the Elamites and Gutians are these obstinate rulers that the Assyrians have had problems with going back generations. But they heard of what the might of the god Assur has done amongst my enemies, and fear and terror poured over them. So basically, these barbarian peoples outside of Assyria, typically they had been very hard to control, but because of the support that the god Assur has given to Esarhaddon, it's just filled them with so much terror that they have no other choice but to come to Esarhaddon's palace and basically bow before him. Now, is that exactly what happened? Probably not. But this is the way that Esarhaddon wants to represent the new relationship that he has with the Elamites and Gutians. So, the significance of all of this is that we can say that for the Assyrians, a treaty was eternal, it was unbreakable, it was enforced by the gods, and it was designed to facilitate the exploitation of weaker powers on Assyria's borders. Now, as I said, we don't have any explicit statements of how the Persians, many centuries we'll see after these treaties were written, we don't know how the Persians would have thought about it. But given the incredibly strong links between the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the later Achaemenid Persian Empire, I don't think it's very extreme to suggest that the Neo-Assyrian concept of a treaty may have at least in part influenced Persian expectations about what a treaty was and how it was to be used, at least as a tool of empire. Now, since we are here to talk about Greco-Persian treaties, we've looked at least a possible model for what the Persian treaty might be. We can also look at Greek examples. We have perhaps slightly better evidence for these, but of course, once again, we are dealing with a fragmentary corpus. And I think right off the bat, we'll see from these representative examples that we're dealing with a different type of text. So from one of the earliest examples between two relatively small Greek states, they say, let there be an alliance of 100 years, and this year will be the first. Basically, if one side needs assistance, especially military assistance, the other one agrees that they'll help out. If one side does not help the other, those who violate should pay a talent of silver to Olympian Zeus, and if someone should damage the text, they will also be liable to this sacred penalty. So here, some similarities. We have the involvement of the gods in the enforcement of the treaty. That's not particularly surprising in the ancient world. We also have the inviolability of the physical text itself. But other than that, we can see major differences. So first, it's limited to 100 years. Now, some scholars have said that, well, 100 years basically is just another way of saying that it's eternal. And I have a very hard time accepting that, because when they want to say that the treaty is eternal, they say that the treaty is eternal. We have examples where it is explicitly spelled out. Not only that, we have treaties that are limited to 50 years or to even 10 years. So for whatever reason, probably having to do with the inherent instability and fragmentation of the Greek world, at least politically, it was just an accepted fact that one state might wish to enter an agreement with another state to deal with a very specific, limited problem that is not expected to continue perpetually. And so you would limit the length of a treaty. Here, the penalty, yes, it is to the god, but it's a fine. Okay, no one's saying that Zeus is going to come down and kill your whole family or something like that, at least not in this case. It's just you pay a monetary fine to the temple of Zeus. Another example, this time between Athens and Chalkis. This comes from a period in the mid-5th century where Athens is at its most imperialistic, tyrannical, however you want to say it. Even in this situation, the stronger power is setting limits on themselves. They're saying that they're not going to deport anyone from the city, they won't destroy the city, execute anyone, at least without a trial. And again, the realities of this, was this a fair treaty? No, it wasn't. It wasn't intended to be. But Athens is acknowledging that there will be limits to its power. And again, the Chalcidians, they say that they won't rebel. That makes perfect sense. But they say that they will also pay a tribute which they are going to persuade Athens to assess. Now, this particular phrasing is, the meaning of it is a little bit debatable, but at least there's the possibility that it's referencing some sort of negotiation about what that level of tribute will be. Again, this is not a good thing for the people of Chalkis. I mean, it is definitely a takeover of sorts by Athens, but there is a limit to what they're willing to do or able to do. And finally, a curse. This is particular phrasing is fragmentary, so we don't know the exact sentence that was being used here, but we do have an invocation of Zeus, Apollo, and Demeter. And the one swearing the oath says that if they violate it, may I and my offspring be utterly destroyed for all time, but if I keep it well, may I have much that is good. So yes, this is a divinely enforced curse, but this is all we get. It is absolutely nothing on the scale that we would find in some of our Assyrian examples. So I think from this very brief overview, we can see that we are dealing with two very different treaty traditions. I think it's wonderful and very important work over the last 50 or so years that has emphasized the cultural links between the Near East and Greece, especially in the realm of religion and literature. But and I'm certainly happy to acknowledge the similarities between whatever treaties we might find from Greece and the Near East. But I think the specific phrases that are used and the way in which the treaties were implemented are very important distinctions. So with that being the case, where we have these two very different treaties, or notions of what a treaty was to be, how do we get to a place where in 450 Athens and Persia are able to come together and make an agreement which I'll just say now, lasts for 35 years, which for the Greek world is a very long period of stability. So in order to answer that question, let's go back just a little bit and talk about the history of Greco-Persian diplomacy in general. Greeks were in the Persian Empire almost from the beginning. Some of Cyrus's initial conquests were in Asia Minor, and there had been Greek cities there for quite a long time, mainly on the coast of the Aegean. But they were just conquered outright. There was no real period of negotiation there. So really we should be starting in about 507, 506 BCE. At that time, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, Athens was once again at war with Sparta. The Spartans and their allies were marching north to take over the city of Athens. And not surprisingly, the Athenians were pretty worried about this. And so they decided to send 2 ambassadors to Asia Minor to go to the city of Sardis, which was the regional capital of someone who's called a satrap. That's a Persian provincial military governor. At this time, his name was Artaphernes. And they asked for some sort of assistance. We don't know exactly what they wanted, but it was help to defend them against this Spartan invasion. And Artaphernes basically says, sure, we'd love to help. All you have to do is give earth and water to King Darius. And again, this is another phrase where we don't know exactly what the implications were. I think the general consensus is this was a symbolic gesture of submission without conquest. You are literally giving your territory, the land and the seaways which you control, and putting them in the hands of the king. The ambassadors seem to have felt that they didn't really have any options, so they agree. They say that they are going to give earth and water. Now, Herodotus does not actually say that they gave earth and water. He says that they agree to give earth and water. The implication being that Athens, as an early democracy, these 2 ambassadors have not been given the power, or perhaps they chose not to execute the power to basically unilaterally make this decision. So they return to their city. They tell their fellow citizens what had happened, and everybody's really upset about it. Herodotus is very clear that the Athenians as a body do not want to enter into this agreement. But as it turns out, there are problems in the Spartan invasion, there's infighting amongst the allies, and it basically dissolves. Everybody goes home before the fight breaks out. So Athens doesn't actually have to call on their new or their potentially new Persian allies. From the Athenian perspectives, that's more or less the end of the story. The treaty or the agreement was never put into place, and so there's really nothing else to talk about. This does not seem to be the Persian interpretation of events. So we have to jump forward a couple years. In 499, approximately, those Greeks who were part of the Persian Empire start a rebellion. We call this the Ionian Revolt. It takes about 7 years for the Persian authorities to completely stamp it out. And at one point, Athens contributes, I believe it was 20 ships to the Ionian effort. And the ships didn't really do much of anything. They more or less run back home as soon as the going gets rough. And again, from the Athenian perspective, this probably wasn't a very big deal. They were helping out fellow Greeks. They didn't really do anything. What's there to talk about? But we can get a suggestion of how the Persians might have interpreted this event by their reaction, because they are going to launch 3 separate imperial campaigns against Athens in particular and Greece as a whole over the next 15 years or so. And it's not likely that the intent of these campaigns was to conquer and permanently hold all of Greece. There's not a whole lot of evidence to support that, although I suppose it is possible. My interpretation and other scholars' interpretation is that the idea was really just to punish Athens because of their participation in the Ionian Revolt. This would mean that for the Persians, the agreement, or the possibility of the agreement between the Athenian ambassadors in 507 was interpreted as submission to the Persian king. And since we said that, based on this Neo-Assyrian model, which may have in some way influenced the Persian conception of treaties and submission, this act of giving earth and water, the commitment to give earth and water, was taken as a sign of complete, eternal, total submission. And to send those ships, regardless of what effect they had, and to give aid to the Ionian rebels, was not just an act of violence against the Persian Empire, it was an act of rebellion, which brings it into the realm of a cosmic crime which the king is obligated to seek vengeance against. Part of the problem that we have in interpreting these events is the notion that the Persian Empire was tolerant, or more tolerant in comparison, especially to their Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian predecessors. A lot of this has to do with, one, just misinterpretation of the texts, and also the influence that the biblical tradition has, because the Hebrew Bible records Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, as a particularly generous and godly man, especially because of the fact that he freed the Jews from their Babylonian captivity and paid for the restoration of their temple in Jerusalem. And no one really denies that that general event took place, but of course it's the interpretation of that event and similar events that the problem arises. So to say that, an ancient empire was tolerant or that they had some sort of respect for minority groups and freedoms of religion is completely anachronistic. There's really no evidence that that sort of belief, because when we talk about tolerance, we're talking about a specific belief, not just an action. There's really no evidence to support that. With that said, there is very good evidence from across the empire that the Persians were in some way willing to acknowledge and interact with local pre-conquest religious and legal traditions. And of course, again, in the ancient world, legal and religious pretty much go together. So, for example, from Asia Minor, which we've already talked about, 2 Greek cities, Miletus and Myus, are having a land dispute. And instead of going to war and deciding who gets the land that way, they go to the satrap, this time it's a man named Struthes, and they ask him to adjudicate. And according to an inscription which records this event, they say that Struthes not only served as the judge, but he appointed basically a jury which was made up of other Greeks to come to his solution to this problem. What this is typically interpreted as a Persian administrator having the final say, but his judgment is going to be based on Greek traditions of jurisprudence. Unfortunately, we don't have very much detail about what sort of testimony or evidence or what the actual procedure was, but it does seem that the Persian satrap is working through traditional, or at least somewhat traditional, Greek legal customs. Another example from Judah, this is taken from the book of Ezra. This text claims to be citing a royal edict of the Achaemenid king Artaxerxes. And this is a statement from the king authorizing Ezra to work as an imperial official. It says that Ezra is to appoint magistrates for his province called Beyond the River. And these magistrates are men who know the laws of your God, that is, the God of the Jewish people, certainly not the God of the Persian king. Ezra is also to teach people about this law, and anyone who does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king is to be punished. So here this is, once again, interpreted as the king, obviously a Persian, taking a local, a Jewish man, putting him in the office of an imperial official. But he is to execute his duties by working through a local legal religious tradition. Again, Artaxerxes is not saying that Persian religious customs are now going to be in force in Judah. And of course, it's not the case that Jewish law is going to be applied in Asia Minor. So what we see is that, at least in these examples, each separate region, maybe it's an entire satrapy, we don't know how fragmented this administrative process would have gotten, but people, at least in certain circumstances, the Persian authorities are willing to work through local custom. Just a final example, this one from Egypt. This is a text known as the Demotic Chronicle. It was written, we believe, after the period of Persian rule ended, but it refers back to the earlier time. And it says that Darius, this is King Darius the Great, wrote to his satrap in Egypt and ordered him to bring together all of the experts who are to write the law of Egypt, which existed from older days until the pharaoh immediately before the Persian conquest. This law of the temples and the people is to be collected and brought here, presumably either to the satrapal residence in Egypt or to a imperial center somewhere in the Persian heartland. So this, again, there are problems with every single one of these texts. What exactly was the author trying to get at? To what extent were they intended to be historically accurate versus propagandistic? We don't really know when exactly were they written. Again, huge problems with that. But in general, we can see that across the empire, we see a general pattern of the Persian administrators not only allowing local traditions to continue, but actually perpetuating themselves as an instrument of the empire. So, we said that the Persian kings, in a indication of their limited tolerance, invaded Greece 3 times. Not only, of course, lots of destruction of lives and property, specifically burning temples, especially in the city of Athens. But ultimately, the Persians were first forced back out of Greece, and even though it caused great destruction to the city of Athens and to other cities as well, they were not destroyed as a people, and in fact, they used this experience to justify their establishment of their own empire. The Athenians called, we refer to this as the Delian League, but it can also be called the Athenian Empire, depending on precisely what time you're talking about and what your perspective is. And the Athenians didn't seem to have a very coherent game plan for what they were going to do with this empire, but they did absolutely wreak havoc in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean region. There was never any real real threat that the Athenians were going to, invade and conquer all of Persia or something like that. This is definitely not Alexander the Great that we're talking about. But nevertheless, it was a serious problem for the Persian Empire because the Athenians, they did have a very competent army, an excellent fleet, and they were able to use these to actually invade Persian territory and score some important victories. They could dominate the sea routes in the Aegean and Mediterranean, and probably most importantly from the Persian perspective was to continually cause or support rebellions in the Egyptian territories. This was an extremely valuable possession of the Persian kings, and if the point of the empire is to extract wealth out of the provinces, if you don't have control of your provinces, then that's, again, really defeating the whole purpose for the empire itself. So this is a problem that they have to solve. Now, perhaps their immediate reflex, as shown in the aftermath of the Ionian Revolt, is a violent, brute force attempt to restore order, but they learned that that didn't work. For whatever reason, Greece was very difficult to conquer. It's very time-consuming, very expensive in money and lives, and ultimately just unsuccessful. So what do? They already have the conscious structures in place to acknowledge and work through local administrative, legal, religious traditions. We saw that this was applied across the empire, and again, it's not about tolerance or respect for other groups. It's really about efficiency. It's a lot easier to go to a conquered elite group and say, keep doing what you're doing. You already know the laws. You have the legal infrastructure already in place. The people are already familiar with these laws, and therefore most likely more likely to accept those laws being placed upon them, as opposed to trying to go in and completely rewrite, generations, maybe centuries of tradition. And so, at this point, in about 450, King Artaxerxes I, he's able to extend this administrative tradition beyond the conquered territories. Because in 449, 448, we have a treaty called the Peace of Calais. Now, there's a lot of debate about this specific treaty, whether or not it actually exists. I believe, for reasons that we can get into later, that it is the best explanation for what is going to come, and so we should accept it. Basically, the agreement is that the king and the Athenians acknowledge each other's empire, and they're going to stay out of the other's way. It is a restriction on the movements of the king, in the sense that he has promised, not to send his armies into Athenian territory anymore. But it is, as I said, an extension of his rule, in the sense that he is not only able to put into practice his traditional administrative strategies, but he's also able to enforce his will. Because really, what we said, the desire of the Persian king is most likely not to conquer Athens. It's not to put a satrap on the Acropolis or something like that. It's to ensure order in the Aegean, in the Mediterranean, and especially in Egypt, Asia Minor, and all those lands where the Athenians might interfere. Now, the results of this, as I said, are basically 35 years of uninterrupted peace between Athens and Persia. It's a great success for the Persian king. Probably one of the reasons for that is because Athens had spent the last 30-odd years not only fighting Persians, but fighting other Greeks. And they've made a lot of enemies at this point, and pretty much as soon as the Peace of Calais is signed, we get the run-up to the Peloponnesian War, this decades-long conflict between Athens and Sparta. The peace appears to have been renewed in about 420. This is with the succession of the king Darius II. And it only comes to an end in about 415 when the Athenians, for reasons that we don't really understand, decide to give help to a rebellious Persian satrap. So this is the second time that the Athenians, from the Persian perspective, have broken an oath and done harm to the Persian Empire. But the Persians aren't going to react in the same way. There is no more invasion of Greek territory. Instead, they once again put into practice the traditional treaty, but this time it's with Sparta. So they simply turn from one Greek city and go to their enemies. And they agree to finance the Spartan war effort against Athens, and after about 10 years, it is successful. Sparta is the victor of the Peloponnesian War. But very quickly, perhaps not surprisingly, the Spartans decide that they are going to bring freedom to all the Greeks, and they start invading Persian territory. So what do the Persians do? They finance the war against Sparta. This is called the Corinthian War. And they're just sending, crate loads of gold and silver to anyone who will take it. Once again, it works. The Spartans are forced to leave Persian territory and go back to Greece to fight their enemies. This is a process that continues down to about the year 387. Now we are in the reign of Artaxerxes II. And what he does is convenes a peace conference. This is the first common peace that we have between the Greeks and the Persians, where basically all the sides agree that every city in Greece is going to be free, which means that there are no more leagues, no more large alliances, where we had the Peloponnesian League, the Delian League. Those are now banned. All the Greeks who are not currently subjects of the king are going to stay out of imperial territory. And perhaps most interestingly, they all agree that if any one party violates the treaty, all of the others will gang up and destroy that one violating city with the support of the Persian king. So basically, the Greeks, without conquest, submit to Persian control over their inter-Greek affairs. So this is really just a stunning success over a period of 75, 80 years for the Persian king. And as I hinted at earlier, this type of common peace will be the pattern for Greco-Persian treaties up to the rise of Philip II and Alexander the Great, and then the whole system falls apart. But that's a whole nother discussion. What I would like to end with is just a couple of ideas that I've had for extensions of this type of research. First is the understanding of Persia in Greek popular culture, and the way that I am thinking about doing this is looking at a series of plays that we find from Athenian writers. Most interestingly for me is the Accordions by Aristophanes. He has a bit part in this play. Pseudartibus, we are told, is the Persian king's eye, and he's come to Athens as an ambassador. It's clear that he is a character to be laughed at. He is the barbarian other. He's dressed funny. He talks funny. And he is definitely humorous, but he has all these other subtleties because he's in Athens because the Athenians want his gold. Okay, and what are they going to do with the gold? They're going to finance their war against Sparta. This was written in the 420s, so right in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. But he's also kind of scary because he's described as having attributes similar to a ship. And for an Athenian, ships mean thousands of ships packed with barbarian soldiers who are going to burn their city again. So he's comical, but we have to take him seriously. He's a sign of potential hope, but he's also a threat. So even though the character is completely historically inaccurate, totally unreasonable that a king's eye would ever be in Athens acting as an ambassador. Nevertheless, I think it is a very interesting window into the Athenian mindset at this very critical period of their history. Another idea that I've had is less well formed is the idea of misinterpretation and miscommunication in interaction between Greeks and Persians. As we saw, the problem with the negotiations of 507, 506 is not that Athenians are particularly untrustworthy or that Persia was making completely unrealistic demands. The problem was that their expectations were completely misaligned because their notions of what an interstate binding agreement would be just come from totally different backgrounds. And so I'm wondering what other of these miscommunications, missed expectations there were in Greco-Persian interaction and what the solution might have been. Another example that comes to mind is the burning of temples. In the ancient Near East, it seems to be a fairly standard operating procedure that if someone rebels or is a particularly troublesome enemy, their temples, at least in certain cases, are fair game. You can destroy them, you can loot them, you can take the divine statues of the gods and bring them back to your own capital. And this is obviously it was a terrible thing to happen to your community, but it was that the meaning of it seems to have been agreed upon. In the Greek world, this is not the case. In certain instances, we do know that Greeks were stealing religious statues from other holy sites, but that appears to be the extent of it. Even at the worst atrocities of the Peloponnesian War, we don't have the burning and looting of religious sites, to my knowledge. I could be wrong on that. And I bring this up because one of the rallying cries of Greek resistance to Persia from the end of the Persian Wars to the burning of Persepolis in 330 by Alexander the Great is the fact that Persians, specifically Xerxes, burned temples. And that means there is something fundamentally wrong with them. These are people who can't be trusted. They just don't act like civilized people because civilized people don't burn temples. And this may or may not have contributed to problems between the Greeks and the Persians, at least rhetorically, as time goes on. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that extremely interesting paper. So we have a good 25 minutes or so for questions, and Daniel's happy to field them.
Isn't it true that you talk about the burning of temples?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it true that the first time that a temple was burned was in Sardis, when the Greeks effectively rebelled against the Persian Empire?
That is true. Herodotus tells the story, if I'm not mistaken, that it was actually an accident, that they were storming the city of Sardis, and some of the cinders blew through the air, and they landed on the temple, and whoops, it burned down. And that the Persians, according to Herodotus, used this as the justification for the invasion of Greece. That reads, to me, that sounds like an excuse for the destruction of the temple, although it is certainly possible. The fact that it wasn't a Greek temple may have something to do with it. I can't say much more beyond that.
But given the history of the Persian Empire and their Cyrus and Darius, the first time the fact that some burning of the temple occurred was in Sardis.
Right.
You could always justify, it was by accident and so forth. But it's hard to believe that could have been the case. And couldn't that be the stuff that actually set the precedent for Xerxes when he went to Athens, and he burned their temple as a sort of a payback.
I absolutely see what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing with it. The issue with that I would have is, again, unless I am mistaken, that was a temple of a local Asian goddess. It was not to the extent that we can say, oh, here are the Greeks and here are other locals and they're totally separate. That's probably not a very smart thing for me to say. But I'm genuinely not sure. I'd have to reread it and think more about it. But the point is well taken.
Daniel, what's the current opinion about Xerxes' Daiwa inscription? That's this inscription in which Xerxes refers to like demons that inhabit the temples of people who rebel. So I guess the implication being you can cleanse these temples by burning them.
Sure. So this is an inscription. It starts out more or less standard. You know, I'm the great King Xerxes. I have the support of Ahura Mazda. I control this great swath of land. And then he says something to the effect of, you know, the areas where the Daivas were worshipped, I did not allow the Daivas to be worshipped there. I performed this very odd phrase that means something to the effect of, you know, I performed the proper sacrifices in the proper way, and I worshipped Ahura Mazda there. This has in the past been taken as a specific historical reference. So, Xerxes is referring to a rebellion in some part of the empire, and he is explaining this in religious terms, but he's referring to a concrete historical event. Now, the most recent interpretations are saying that this is an ideological statement, and that it only refers to the proper worship of Iranian gods in an Iranian context. So, to be very clear, you know, the jury is still out on this, but the religion of the Achaemenids in the royal inscriptions is different than the religion that existed in the Persian Empire, even within the heart of the empire, within the imperial administration. So, yeah, to summarize, it's a statement connecting Xerxes very strongly to the god that he claims in this particular context as his, or one of his sources of legitimacy, but it is not a policy statement and it's not a historical record.
So the difference between the two religions, the Achaemenid and the empire, was there a significant difference in ideologies of those two religions, or was it just a token of who's in charge now?
So the issue is that when the Persian king is acting and writing as a Persian, in his inscriptions, he's making references mainly to Ahura Mazda, who is an Iranian god. When he is acting as, or someone that he's appointed, you know, a crown prince or a satrap or something like that, is acting as pharaoh in Egypt, he is performing Egyptian religious rituals as the pharaoh ought to. So he's not coming in and saying, I am a Persian and you're going to do things the Persian way. But that's in his role as an officer of the king of Egypt, not as the king of Persia. And I understand that it's the same person, but there's no, in the mindset that they had, there's no contradiction there. There were many, many different religions in the empire. There doesn't seem to have been any attempt or any desire to enforce religious uniformity. And as I've said many times, there's the ability to work through the existing tradition in Egypt, in Babylon, wherever else we might find the evidence.
You might think of Mazda as associated with the Zoroastrians?
Yes. I'm certainly not an expert on Iranian religion specifically, but yes, there's some sort of connection with what we would call Zoroastrianism, but it doesn't seem to be, well, I'll leave it before, again, I get myself into trouble. But
you mentioned, and you have to forgive me, I don't know very much about the sources here, I mean, we know a lot about the relations between Persian and Greeks because we have so many Greek sources,
right.
But are there any examples of these kinds of treaties or Persian strategy, you know, in like Central Asia or with India or with the Arabs or
right.
with other groups on the frontiers of the empire?
So, not surprisingly, our evidence for their interaction with non-Greeks comes from Greeks. So it's already a problem. But, so as in my article I talk about, there's Cyrus the Great is, in one of the stories, is said to have died in somewhere in Central Asia. And he invades this one particular kingdom, and I believe that there is the possibility of a marriage alliance, but it is not accepted, and then he dies, and so that's the end of that. Diodorus Siculus says that Xerxes wanted to make a treaty with the Carthaginians, and so that the Carthaginians would invade Sicily while Xerxes was invading Greece, and this would mean that the Sicilians couldn't help the other Greeks repel the Persians. This seems to be Sicilian propaganda. There was a concerted effort by some tyrants in Syracuse to make themselves, to synchronize their own efforts in consolidating their rule of Sicily against the barbarian Carthaginians with other Greek efforts to repel the barbarian Persians. So we do have stories about potential diplomatic relations with non-Greeks, but they all seem to be Greek constructs. So long story short, no. Sure.
Another question on divers.
Okay.
Is there any indication that in the Achaemenid Empire, so Asuras and Devas, or Ahuras and Devas, seem to split up two groups of Indo-Iranian gods,
Yeah.
right? Are non-Indo-Iranian gods, like those worshipped by the Greeks, lumped in with the category of divas? Is this something that we can even establish based on our sources?
I would say no, because, so one, when Xerxes talks about the divas, I believe that there is no explanation or naming of these demons or false gods or whatever we want to call them. They're just given this title and then it's left at that. And this is a inscription, I believe, from Persepolis, so like literally the heart of the empire. And at Persepolis, we have the Persepolis Fortification Archives, where we have records of the Persian imperial treasury giving support to not only non-Persian, but, well, to a variety of gods. And there's a lot of great research coming out about the Persepolis archives, so I'm probably not as up-to-date as I ought to be. But what we see is there's certainly no domination of Ahura Mazda, and there is a variety of gods that are, at least in their origins, non-Iranian, although we have to ask the question, an Iranian living at that time doesn't, we have this historical perspective, but they don't. So if a god is worshipped there when they're alive and they're Iranian, it's an Iranian god to them. So if we're going to be drawing distinctions between Iranian and non-Iranian gods, it's hard to tell what they thought about that. As opposed to, say, Greek gods, the Persian kings and military commanders give offerings to Greek gods when they're in Greek territory. And they have no problem doing that. But again, that is in their role of king of Greece or potential administrator of Greece. That is not in their role of king of Persia and the favorite of Ahura Mazda type of thing. So for modern people typically coming from a monotheist background, this can be problematic, but for them there doesn't seem to be any inherent contradiction at all. So. Sure.
fascinating. Thank you. I had not thought about this in these. I had not thought about it in these terms.
Okay, good.
Well, yeah. As I said, thank you. So let's see. So the reception. So the reception of Themistocles is the reception of a repentant rebel.
Okay.
Question mark. What do you think of the Cyrus? What do you think of the Cyrus cylinder? Question mark.
Okay.
And what about the looting? What about the looting of Perdicellaus, which Herodotus clearly thinks is important? Because he puts it at the end of the book.
Can you just repeat that last part?
Perdicellaus.
Okay.
Which where the Persian general proceeds to march in and rob it on the way out.
Okay. So your first question was about Themistocles and his later career.
Yeah, and
yes.
he is fleeing to Persia.
Right.
Which
So
they seem to have had no problem.
Oh, absolutely. So when we ask how the Persians and Greeks were able to come together in 450, one of their sources of information would have been Greek exiles. We talked about earlier Medism, so there were plenty of Greeks during the Persian Wars who, as I guess Cockwell would have suggested, they went over to the Persian side. They didn't physically move to Persian territory, but they, in various ways, gave support to the Persian enterprise. The whole city of Thebes is singled out as being particularly guilty of Medism. But there were individuals who, for a very long time, went to Persia to live basically as exiles. They would have been a very valuable source of information on Greek language, Greek culture, the particular weaknesses within that could be exploited within Greek cities, in between Greek cities. So yeah, they would have been more than happy to have someone like Themistocles. During the Persian Wars, there was a Greek exile named Hippias, who was forced out of the city of Athens, and he actually accompanied the Persian expedition. And it makes it pretty clear he was going to be installed as a tyrant, more or less a puppet ruler for the Persians in Greece. So yeah, this is how exiles like Themistocles would have been put to use given the opportunity. As for the Cyrus cylinder, this is another very interesting document that has been completely mutilated by scholarly interpretation, and I think it's only within the past couple of decades that we're undoing the damage that was done, specifically because Cyrus is such an interesting character. He keeps showing up in all this historical literature when everybody's got their own spin on him, and as people who are at least nominally interested in getting to some sort of historical fact, it's troublesome to get rid of all these other layers. But long story short, Cyrus was well aware, probably through various types of informants or exiles like we just talked about, from the city of Babylon. He knew what their expectations were. He knew what their desires would have been. He knew how to exploit divisions within the Babylonian elite, and that's what the Cyrus cylinder is. It's basically him saying, I am a traditional Babylonian and or Assyrian king. I'm going to be a really great guy to you elites. I'm going to give you everything you wanted. I'm going to restore all your temples. So you should just come over to me and everything will be easy. It's interesting to note that our Greek sources, I think almost uniformly, say that there was some sort of conflict for the city of Babylon. It was actually not peaceful, not entirely peaceful the way that the Cyrus cylinder wants us to think it was. So yeah, the Cyrus cylinder is very interesting, but we have to remember that it is a propagandistic statement, no less valuable for us as historians, but it is not a factual historical account of events. Herodotus and Protesilaus. I don't have anything to say. I apologize.
I think maybe the bigger crime was having sex with women in the temple rather than, as well as taking all the stuff out of it.
Sure, sure. Yeah, there are notions of, again, what a temple's function was, both religiously, how it was supposed to, secure protection and beneficence for the people, but also how it functioned as a political and economic center within a community. I think that has a lot to do with how the Persians treated temples, and maybe in ways that were unexpectedly not very successful in the Greek world. Again, probably has a lot to do with the fractured nature of Greek society.
So were the Greeks the ones having sex in the temple?
No, the Persian satrap, but the historian
Yes.
Herodotus says that he fooled Xerxes into giving him the temple, saying, there's the house of a man here who did damage to your country, can I have it? And
Right.
Xerxes didn't know that he was asking for the treasure, to take over this temple.
I hadn't thought about that, though. That would be something interesting to incorporate
Because
into the discussion.
because
Yeah.
because certainly nothing says he's Athenian. So all the discussion of Athenian temples are to one side.
Sure. Sure. Yes.
On the first map with the solid borders,
Yeah.
I just noticed that it seems as if the Persians are sort of steering clear of Arabia completely, and I was just wondering why they would.
So my knowledge of ancient Arabia is slim to none, unfortunately. But what?
It's a desert, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there really wasn't much. There's not much. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about huge swaths of land that were. There would have been caravan routes, but again, because this is not a territorial empire, it's not about controlling land. It's about controlling these nodes of where there is an elite group that you can very easily exert control over, and it's their responsibility to deal with the desert and the caravans, and you just make sure that they give you taxes when they're told to do so. So, in that sense, there was, if you're controlling the major port cities of Phoenicia, you're controlling Babylon and other cities up and down the rivers, that's the important part. It's not about the land itself. So, yes?
Just picking up on your argument about sort of mismatch between Greek and Persian traditions of treaty making. This is too big a question. But
That's fine.
your thoughts, but how, given that we know that there are Greeks who know a lot about Persia and Persians who know a lot about Greek, how much awareness do you think there is of this lack of fit? Is this something that we can see people deliberately exploiting to get
Oh, interesting.
So the Athenians really know what they're doing. Do they know what the Persians are trying to do when they sign a piece of chaos, or is everyone being a bit of an idiot? Or is the people making the treaties being a bit of an idiot?
Right. My assumption is that in 507, both of the sides probably didn't know too much of what they were doing. By call it 450, there had to have been much more understanding between the two. Whether or not anyone was exploiting that, that's a very interesting question. I don't think that the Athenians were taken by surprise that suddenly Persia is no longer an enemy and now all of a sudden we're at war with Sparta. That was probably their intention. I mean, nobody, it's basic military strategy. You don't want to fight a two-front war, right? So you can't go to war with Sparta and Persia at the same time, even if Persia is not going to be your ally. But whether... call that exploitation of that. That's a very interesting way of putting it. It does seem very clear, and very clear that the Persians, after this point, knew exactly what they were doing in playing Sparta and Athens off each other. And at least, I know Plutarch has, is it Plutarch or Xenophon having Agesilaus saying, oh, he wasn't defeated in Persia, it's, the king's archers chasing him out of Asia and back to Greece. So this is Persian coinage, that's really his weak spot. So eventually the Greeks picked up on it, but it seems to have taken a couple of decades. But other than that, yeah, I'd have to think about that, but that's very interesting. I like that. Did you have anything in mind?
I'm thinking of poor old Antalcidas
Okay.
starving himself to death because he got plagued by the Is it Antiochus who ends up starving to death in shame at being
Um,
failing to renegotiate? That's another Plutarch story, so it may but we do get this sort of sense in some of the sources that the Greeks don't know what they're doing when they're dealing with Persia. But on the other hand,
right.
it's something surely they should have done.
And I think that that might be more of effect of 4th century rhetoric, especially with the Peace of Antiochus. It's that, this is the most shameful thing that has ever happened to Greece, which it's really not that much different than what the Athenians did. It's more or less exactly what they did. So we are very much influenced by the Athenian rhetorical tradition as opposed to understanding what it was in its exact context. So, yes?
In what sense the King's Peace was pretty much what the Athenians did?
To the extent that the Peace of Callias freed up the Athenians to go to war with Sparta. I think that the Peace of Antiochus, there was a preliminary negotiation in the 390s at some point, which was, I believe, also at least instigated in part by Antiochus, was the desire of Sparta to exert more control over certain Greek cities, because immediately after the treaty in 387 is signed, Sparta turns around and starts attacking other cities for not signing up to the peace. And we can read that as just trying to enforce the rules, but I think it was at least in part designed to help Sparta exploit the situation. So, yes.
To me, you did a wonderful job of setting forth this topic. You really made it understandable. I thought it was splendid.
Glad I could help.
But I also think that the strategy is the elites, what they are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are always the people who probably haven't got a clue why we're doing it, as always, I imagine. But from the literature, it seems to me, and because I'm seeing it in a new light, it seems that the Persians are almost always representative as kind of swishy and wearing silks and
Oh, yes.
baggy
Oh,
and
yes.
all that kind of stuff. And Euripides was really big on that. It was not that long ago that the Athenians established the famous Olympian religion instead of the Chthonic religion, where they had the agricultural gods with the Furies, and they're going to come and get you, all those bad guys.
Okay,
They're going to
right.
hang out in the temples and hide from the old religion. So I think that they probably used both of those things in their propaganda, that these sissy Persians and these dangerous gods, and that's going to be what you're going to get if you go over there. So it seems to me like the stuff that you riled up the populace with when everybody had to go to the theater. Everybody went. They took
Sure.
them to prison so they could go.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me. Also about the Accordions.
Okay.
You do not mention what I take to be part of the king's eye, which is that he's smarter than the Athenians.
Yes.
And this is
Yes.
those idiot politicians aren't going to get any gold out of Persians because they're idiots. You should make peace.
Yeah, so Pseudartibus comes back to Athens with a pair of Athenians who had gone before the Persian king and to try and get this gold. And these Athenians go back and forth between pretending that they can't understand Pseudartibus and then in the next line translating for him about, how all the things that the Persian king is going to do for them. So yeah, and Pseudartibus, in this case, his name is Pseudartibus. So pseudo meaning false, right? But he is the only one telling the truth. So again, it's poking fun at Persians for being untrustworthy and not really fit to be ambassadors, but it's also poking fun at the Athenians themselves. So yeah, he's a very interesting character considering he only has about 5 lines. So yeah, and half of them are unintelligible. So yeah.
Okay, one more question?
Yeah, it's kind of a comment and question. Let's talk about kind of the propaganda you brought up of the Greeks against the Persians.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the sculptural program on the Parthenon and
Okay.
the Temple of Athena Nike, and how, I guess, on the Parthenon, the Persians are depicted as Amazon standing for the Persians because, like, in light of this talk about treaties, the Greeks are careful not to actually depict the Persians as enemies the same way they don't set up permanent trophies versus other Greek cities and things like that. But then the Persians are only depicted as Persians themselves on the Temple of Nike that's put up around the time the Peace of Callias falls apart. And like,
Interesting.
I wonder if, like, what you think about that is in, like, the Athenians are making this conscious break of that, like, by actually representing the Persians as Persians and not putting in a mythical stand-in, they're, like, declaring their intention to be, like, done with Persia diplomatically, even though maybe that's not the case in the future, but...
I am only somewhat aware of the Athenian, I guess, artistic propaganda, but I think that when we, for propaganda, we have to understand not just the message that is being conveyed, but the specific audience that is intended to receive it. So within the city of Athens, we have to assume that Persians are not going to be seeing it for the most part, although if there are ambassadors coming, they would probably be seeing this. Yeah, I'd have to look more into it, but that is I did not realize that there was the connection between the creation of the treaty and the end of the agreement and the change in the artistic program. So that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.